Hello, today we will be presenting our topic, that being homelessness among the Indigenous population of Canada. To start, what is homelessness? Homelessness is defined as the state of having no home or permanent place of residence, as per the Encyclopedia Britannica. But the concept of homelessness is very complex, and its definition greatly impacts the policies that are made in order to address it, and the research done in order to document and understand it. At its core, homelessness refers to a lack of shelter, but this definition is far too vague to be used. But does having any sort of shelter make you not homeless? Will living in your car or in a house without running water or heating make you avoid homelessness? The United Nations would say that living in such conditions would in fact make you homeless, as it defines homelessness as lacking a shelter, but also living in a shelter that does not have access to the basic requirements essential for health and human development. Those requirements are secure occupancy, protection from the weather and personal security, as well as access to sanitary facilities, drinking water, jobs, and health and education services. As stated in 1987, the International Year for Shelter for the Homeless. There is still an aspect of homelessness that needs to be taken into account, and that is the duration of homelessness, as different conditions can lead to significant differences in the time spent being homeless. For example, someone who is unemployed and has substance use disorder may face significantly more time in a state of homelessness than a person who lost their house to a fire but has a good source of income and an adequate support network. Taking that into account, we can categorize homelessness in three different types. First type, chronic homelessness, which includes people who live in the periphery of society and who will often suffer from substance use disorder or mental illness. Then, cyclical homelessness, which includes people who experience periodic instances of homelessness due to changes in their lives, such as the loss of a job, having to move, being hospitalized or incarcerated, or being in a halfway house or women's shelter. And last, temporary homelessness, which includes people who are homeless for a short period of time due to disasters or sudden life changes. Overall, homelessness can be defined as a condition in which one or many individuals lack stable, adequate housing, and it takes the form of three different categories: chronic homelessness, cyclical homelessness, or temporary homelessness. Homelessness in the Indigenous population has its roots deeply embedded in the history of colonization in Canada. Since the 17th century and all the way to the late 90s, residential schools were created in order to suppress the cultures and histories of Indigenous children in an effort to assimilate them to the non-Indigenous population. These schools operated by removing Indigenous children from their families and keeping them there throughout the year until their mandatory time there was done. There were numerous very negative consequences for the Indigenous population. Children in those schools were not allowed to speak their native tongues, so this made communication with the rest of their families worse and played a role in preventing the passing down of the Indigenous oral histories from generation to generation. Conditions in the school were very bad, with poor access to sanitation, healthcare, and food. Unchecked spread of infectious diseases led to the deaths of many children. Children also suffered from physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. Parents lost their parenting skills. Children were ultimately left feeling hopeless about the education system, leading many of them to combat that feeling with alcohol, substances, and many of them were driven to suicide. But the residential schools were not the only part of colonization of Canada to greatly disrupt the native populations, as multiple treaties of the Canadian government displaced the Indigenous population from their land, forcing them into reserves. Those reserves were still under the influence of the Canadian government, which controlled their resources through the Indian Act of 1876. This allowed the government to extract resources from the territories, which drained the already strained traditional economic activities of Indigenous people, such as hunting. More recently, the First Nations had to endure the 60s scoop, where Indigenous children were forcefully removed from their homes and were adopted mostly by non-Indigenous families. This led many of the adopted children to lose their cultural identities and left many with lasting emotional distress. Overall, researchers estimate that around 11,000 children were taken from their families, but recent studies suggest that this number may go up to 20,000. All these factors led to the multiple risk factors associated today, such as discrimination, substance abuse, poverty, lower education level, and less stable families.
Statistics. Although indigenous people make up only about 5% of Canadian total population, they are dramatically overrepresented in the homeless statistics. Between 2020 and 2022, roughly 35% of 35% of the individuals identified in the national point in time homelessness counts were indigenous. Similarly, in 2021, indigenous people accounted for 39.1% of all emergency shelter users, despite representing a small portion of the overall population. When looking at lifetime experience of homelessness, approximately 29.5% of indigenous people of indigenous households reported having faced some form of homelessness, compared to about 9.5% of all Canadian households, meaning indigenous households were 3 times more likely to experience homelessness. Gender difference. Gender difference are also significant. Indigenous men represent a large share of those experiencing visible homelessness or staying in shelters, while indigenous women are more likely to face hidden homelessness, such as couch surfing or staying in unsafe or overcrowded housing. Women also experience higher rates of house insecurity due to family violence, poverty, and discrimination. In some urban shelters, indigenous women make up over 50% of all female shelter users. Beyond homelessness itself, the housing condition faced by indigenous community remains deeply concerning. In 2021, about 17% of indigenous people lived in crowded housing, compared to 9.4% of non-indigenous people, and 16.4% live in homes needing major repairs, compared to 5.7% among non-indigenous households. The Assembly of First Nations estimate that approximately 157,000 new homes are needed across First Nation communities to address the long-standing housing deficit. These figures reveal more than just numerical disparities. They expose the structural and historical inequality that persists today. Centuries of colonial disinvestment, chronic underfunding, and discriminatory housing policies have produced a landscape where indigenous people are far more likely to face homelessness, overcrowding, overcrowding, and inadequate housing than the rest of the Canadian population. As we can see on the chart, you can clearly see the comparison of housing needs across the different groups in Canada. So we have the indigenous people, the black community, the LGBT community, and the general population. So you will see the table, and we move to the next part that I'm going to present, which is going to be the general characteristics. General characteristics: indigenous homeless, indigenous, indigen. Oh man, stop that. General characteristics: indigenous homelessness in Canada takes many forms and cannot be understood solely through the lens of visible street homelessness. It encompasses a wide range of experiences: urban homelessness, hidden homelessness, and housing insecurity on reserves, all shaped by historical, social, and structural factors. So we're going to look where homelessness occurs. While many indigenous people experiencing homelessness live in urban cities such as Winnipeg, Vancouver, Edmonton, Montreal, significant hidden and episodic homelessness also occur in smaller communities and on reserves. On reserves, overcrowding, housing in disrepair, and unlimited infrastructure often conceal displacement. Families may live in unsafe or overcrowded houses or move frequently between relatives' house, masking the true extent of homelessness. This condition often pushes individuals to leave their communities in search of housing and opportunities in urban areas, where they may face additional barriers such as discrimination and high rental costs. So we're going to look who is affected. Homelessness affects all indigenous groups, but it disproportionately impacts youth, women, and the LGBT plus individuals. Indigenous youth are especially vulnerable. Many age out of foster care without stable housing, community support, or adequate life skills, leaving them at a high risk of homelessness. Indigenous women often experience hidden homelessness, such as staying temporarily with friends or family to avoid violence or losing custody of their children. Two-spirit, transgender, and gender diverse indigenous people face additional layers of discrimination and exclusion, often finding both mainstream shelters and indigenous housing service unsafe or unwelcoming. These patterns are deeply intertwined with colonial legacies, intergenerational trauma, and ongoing effects of child welfare involvement, violence, and systemic racism. Indigenous homelessness extends far beyond absence of physical shelter. According to the 12 dimensions of indigenous homelessness, developed by scholar Jess Teasel, it includes disconnection from land, culture, language, community, identity, and spirituality. For Indigenous people, being homeless can mean being cut off from one's traditional territory, family network, or cultural practice. A profound sense of loss that goes beyond material deprivation. In this sense, Indigenous homelessness represents a spiritual, cultural, and relational dislocation, not just a lack of housing. Together, these characteristics reveal that Indigenous homelessness in Canada is multidimensional and systemic, rooted in colonial history, social inequality, and cultural disruption. Addressing it requires approaches that restore connection to home, connection to land, and connection to community, and connection to identity.
The Indigenous population in Canada is caught in a cycle of poverty which is so significant that people can become unhoused. The population experiences barriers to finding housing, employment, and education. Many homeless Indigenous people cycle through shelters. They have curfews, restrictions, or limited privacy, and this can conflict with work hours or transportation needs. Many job applications require an address. If you appear unstable, you can seem unreliable. These living situations often interrupt education or training programs, which creates a recurring pattern of instability. Lack of education leads to unemployment and poverty, which increases the risk of homelessness, which in turn prevents educational achievement. Regarding education, Indigenous schooling differs from the Canadian standards outside the reserve. It is more focused on spirituality and group values. Therefore, it cannot provide qualifications to acquire a job outside the reserve. Another cause of homelessness is victimization. Several survival methods are criminalized. To survive on the streets, sometimes people have no choice but to break laws about disturbing the public peace by panhandling, sleeping in public, or stealing food. Many landlords refuse people with a criminal record. Homeless individuals often lack reliable transportation, access to computers or the internet, or professional attire, all of which are needed for job searching, interviews, or maintaining a job. Being in a period without having a job might deter employers, as they can see gaps in resumes negatively, regardless of whether they are a result of structural barriers rather than ability. Also, the visible homeless people on the street can get dirty and appear unhealthy, which is also stigmatizing and gives a negative impression to employers. An underlying issue that can perpetuate poverty in the population is intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma is trauma which has been passed down through generations and can trickle down through multiple areas of life, not just for the survivors, but also for descendants who have not been born yet at the time of the original trauma. It can affect your biology by triggering changes in expressions of your genes. This means that you can pass down genes to your children that can negatively affect their well-being, conditions such as mental disorders or genes that make one vulnerable to addiction. This means that suffering is shared within a family and can trigger behavior that renders a child homeless because of underlying emotional issues. Through nurture as well, parents who have experienced adversity can have maladaptive parenting styles. For instance, a mother who becomes an alcoholic as an attempt to assuage post-traumatic thinking patterns can set an example to her child that drugs are the answer to help yourself when you're having a problem, and this child can grow up to lose their home because of a dependency problem. However, all this being said, homelessness might be a preference for some Indigenous people because of how hard it is to integrate into mainstream culture. Perhaps because finding low-cost housing in Montreal means that you will get a small living space. Living on the streets as a group of people is more ideal for cultures who have a preference for communal living. Being homeless has immediate short-term impacts on personal hygiene, safety, and keeping belongings. Hygiene issues are highly visible. In a course at TAV College, Foundations of Adaptation Problems, we completed a project where students visited locations in Montreal to give bags of essential items, snacks, hygiene products, and other necessities for people experiencing homelessness. We were assigned areas near Place des Arts, Atwater, and Villa Maria metro stations, all of which had small groups of Indigenous people living on the streets nearby. After giving tampons to a woman, we reflected on how incredibly difficult it must be for women to manage their menstrual hygiene without access to basic products. Spending even a short time unhoused can lead to chronic uncleanliness and discomfort. Safety is another urgent concern. With few private or protected spaces, people on the streets are vulnerable to predators, other individuals who may seek to exploit their vulnerability. Survival strategies, such as engaging in prostitution, can further increase the risk of physical or sexual abuse. Finally, the security of personal belongings is constantly threatened. Essential or cherished items can be stolen, adding stress and anxiety to an already precarious situation and compounding the immediate hardships of street life. Long-term impacts of homelessness are health problems, the development of substance use disorders, and weakened ties or a loss of connection with their culture. Income is a big factor to determine how healthy one is. People who are homeless are more likely to fall ill and have a general lower life expectancy. Harsh weather, sleep deprivation, and lack of access to proper nutrition all create health problems. Being Indigenous and unhoused makes access to general health care services difficult. In Montreal, many Indigenous people are not approaching the healthcare system because of inherent feelings of injustice as a result of many years of structural racism. They can be excluded from mainstream medicinal aid. Homelessness is a strong risk factor for mental health problems. It is extremely stressful, and stress can trigger anxiety, depression, fear, and insomnia. It causes states of hypervigilance. Struggling for food and shelter triggers the fight or flight response. You are on high alert for threats such as harsh weather conditions and not knowing when you will get your next meal. There is also predation on the streets, which can cause somebody who is homeless to develop PTSD, which is a mental health disorder that will be a part of you for your entire life. Something else you experience when you're homeless is invisibility. You may try to get somebody's attention, to ask them for money, but often people don't even make eye contact with you as if you're not there, and this can be harmful for somebody's personal identity. There is a high rate of substance abuse and addiction in the Indigenous population, and this carries health and behavior risks, which will affect your entire life. It can be fatal. It also affects how you will spend the little money you have to survive, whether it will go towards purchasing drugs or whether anybody gives you any help at all. If you're begging for money, being intoxicated isolates you from people who can help, because people generally don't feel safe approaching others who are intoxicated. Issues with addiction can also create traumatic scenarios. An example of which is when a mother is pregnant with a child and cannot quit using drugs. For example, near Atwater Metro, there is a homeless shelter called Chez Doris, and there was an Indigenous woman in the soup kitchen who was talking about how she can't quit drugs because of how much she loves them while she was pregnant at the time. If a child is harmed in any way because of this issue, it can be so tragic for a mother, which can lead to more substance abuse to suppress these feelings, creating a cycle of addiction. The aforementioned barriers they have to health services means that there are fewer interveners in these situations. What can really help a group with a history of discrimination is sticking together. It is harder when you have weak ties to your community. Sharing food, huddling together, expressing affection, all play a part in somebody's survival. You can see in Montreal how disconnected this community is on the streets from each other, how each group is in different places and the city is so small.
Hi, my name's Karina, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about existing solutions. So in the late 90s, the government started addressing homelessness in general by implementing several programs. There was the National Homeless Initiative, which aimed to reduce homelessness in youths, Indigenous people, and in urban areas. The Homelessness Partnering Strategy, which funds Indigenous communities, a homelessness network, and offers spare federal infrastructure for use in combating homelessness, and the Affordable Housing Initiative, which aimed to increase affordable housing. These programs fell short solving the problem for homelessness, but it was a step to the right direction. More recently, the Canadian government has taken additional measures to help Indigenous people in Canada, such as the Urban, Rural, and Northern Indigenous Housing Strategy, which is planned to start in 2025, also known as the fiscal year, and aims to increase housing affordability for the Indigenous people with a current budget of 4.3 million Canadian. A 918 Canadian dollar investment to address housing and infrastructure gaps in Indigenous communities. We also have Reaching Home. Canada's homeless strategy has allocated nearly 900 million Canadian for the homeless Indigenous since 2019 and has funded over 3,000 projects with Indigenous people as a priority and has helped over 25,000 Indigenous people to receive more stable housing. And last but not least, we have the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has provided more than 700 million Canadian to the Indigenous Shelter and Transitional Housing Initiative, 420 million of which is dedicated to the creation of 38 shelters and 50 transitional homes. The Canadian government also created a hotline for people who suffer from trauma from residential schooling. It offers emotional and crisis referral services. This is a 24-hour crisis hotline, which is excellent. And to be specific, the number is 1-866-925-4419. The solutions are very helpful, but unfortunately, they're a little bit insufficient at managing the number of homeless Indigenous people who are needing help, and that has always been problematic.
Comparison with other countries. So this is a comparison between 4 countries, which include Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And this comparison will take statistics that I already presented above, that the statistics for Canada, and here we're comparing the differences that the Indigenous community in each of these countries face. So in Canada, as it was mentioned, in Canada, Indigenous people make up about 5% of the total population, yet they represent, as of 2020 and 2022, roughly 31 to 35% of the homeless community, and similarly in 2021, 39.1% of the emergency shelter users identified as indigenous. These figures reveal a persistent overrepresentation. Indigenous people are nearly 7 times more likely to experience homelessness than non-Indigenous Canadians. The main factor driving this imbalance includes, as mentioned earlier, colonial displacement, systemic discrimination, intergenerational trauma, chronic underfunding of housing and social services in Indigenous community. So those are the statistics for Canada. We have the statistics for Australia. In Australia, Aboriginals and the Torres Strait Islander people account for roughly 3% of the national population, yet they represent about 20% of the people experiencing homelessness. That is as of 2021 counts. This means their rate of homelessness is approximately 8.8 times higher than that of the non-Indigenous Australian. The primary cause mirrored those in Canada: colonial dispossession, remote housing shortage, overcrowding, the barriers to culturally appropriate housing services. In many remote regions, Indigenous families live in overcrowded homes, and poor access to affordable housing in urban areas often leads to displacement and social exclusion. So we move to the next country that we're going to compare them with, which is New Zealand. So in New Zealand, its indigenous community, referred to as the Maori, experience high levels of housing deprivation and homelessness. Although they represent about 17% of the national population, Maori are disproportionately represented among those living in severe housing deprivation, temporary shelters, and overcrowding dwellings. Data from 2023 show a continual rise in housing insecurity among Maori communities, largely linked to colonial land use, systemic inequalities in housing access, and economic barriers. These challenges have also contributed to growing numbers of Maori families living in substandard housing or relying on temporary arrangements. Now we go to the United States and see how their own people, how the indigenous people in the United States are doing. In the United States, American Indians and Alaska Natives people are likewise overrepresented among the homeless population. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2024 Annual Housing Assessment Report, individuals experiencing disproportionate rates of homelessness please give me a moment. Individuals experiencing disproportionate rates of homelessness and are less likely to access shelter services compared to other racial or ethnic groups. Many indigenous communities face high levels of unsheltered homelessness, reflecting the lack of affordable housing and cultural appropriate support systems. These patterns are closely tied to historical displacement, poverty, and ongoing inequality in resource distribution. In conclusion, across all four countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, a clear pattern emerged. Indigenous people are significantly more likely to experience homelessness than non-Indigenous population, despite differing social and political contexts. The underlying causes are strikingly similar: colonial legacies, systemic racism, inadequate housing infrastructure, and social exclusion. Meaningful solutions therefore require reconciliation-based housing strategies, culturally grounded services, and long-term government investment that prioritize indigenous self-determination and housing sovereignty. So we have a graph below that simplifies everything or makes for a better understanding of the statistics of that I just presented, or these the differences or the comparisons I made between the indigenous community and of each country and their population. So we have on the graph, as you can see, well represented. And thank you. That'll be all from me.
A problem present within our topic was the lack of awareness people had towards the general situation, that being that a disproportionate amount of Indigenous people make up the population of homeless people, which leads to them being unable to help in any meaningful way. We chose to address this problem by organizing a clothes drive in TAV and setting up posters to encourage our fellow students to join in. During the event, we would gather donated clothes, as well as hand out brochures explaining in brief the situation, as well as providing information on possible locations for more donations. We would also offer additional information for anyone interested.
Hi, I'm here with Atali, and I'm giving her the brochure about Indigenous homelessness in Canada. So she's learning about how, like, in the Indigenous population are the most homeless in Montreal, and just how to help, that she can donate at these organizations, or she can bring us clothes. Okay, thank you.
So here's a brochure that describes the situation of Indigenous homeless people in Canada. You'll find information regarding like their origins and what to do to combat it, but on the back you also find resources where you can donate clothes or various items, and also our names, so if you have any questions you can come contact us.
Okay, thank you. Are you zooming in?
Action.
I'd like to give this to your cause.
Oh, thank you very much. And would like to hand you this. It's a brochure, and on there you find information about the homeless community in Montreal, and we'll make sure your donations get to the right organizations that are going to use it for the right cause. So if you have any information, you can contact us. And thank you. Thank you for your donation.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
We are glad that you're able to take part in our project, because I and a couple of other classmates, we chose the topic of the Indigenous homeless community in Canada, and we're focusing on the Indigenous people here in Montreal. So we decided to do a clothing drive and some kind of an informational session.
Right.
So we could collect some stuff, people's donations that we're going to hand to some organizations that are taking care of the Indigenous community here, right here in Montreal, and also educate people what the Indigenous community people here in Montreal are going through. So this brochure, you can look through it. Basically, what we're trying to let people know is the number of homeless people. We know it's disturbing here in Montreal, but what is more disturbing is the percentage of the Indigenous people who are within that population.
Disproportionate.
Yeah, so when we, for example, when we look at the population of the Indigenous people in general in Canada, they are just 5% of that population. But when you look at the percentage of them who are homeless, it surpasses every other community. So in the brochure we have that pointed out, like look at the Black community, the percentage of the people who are homeless, the LGBT community, those who are homeless, and when you see on the graph, the percentage that represents the Indigenous people surpasses all of the other community combined. They have more homeless people out there more than any other community combined. So that's why we're trying to sensitize people that they should care about them, right. That they should push whenever they're advocating for laws that will help the Indigenous community. We should stand behind these people. So it's because it's a big project. It's something that us at our own level, what we see that we can do is inform people, because for a change to happen, we really need the government to do something about it, and for them to do something about it, we have to make it a priority for us as the citizens. Absolutely. So we're trying to educate.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah, intergenerational trauma is a big one.
Yeah. So we could actually see that not only the Indigenous people in Montreal, in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand, they all have the same pattern of.
Even I think for incarceration, I think they represent the women, 42% of the incarcerated women, which is.
Oh yeah, I think we did a class together and we talked about that.
Yeah. Well, the residential schools were not that old, right? The last one closed. Remember when? 1991.
Whoa, that's so close.
Yeah, that's really not that far, 1996 maybe, but those were.
Yeah, so.
It's a lot of trauma. We're definitely not.
And that pattern is not only here in Canada. That's the thing. In our project, in our research, we discovered that it repeats itself not only here in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand. The same pattern. They are overrepresented in the homeless community. So
thank you for doing that.
Oh, thank you very much for being part of it. Yeah, you can get it.
Yay!
I have to go teach it again.
So thank you guys for all the donations.
Thank you very much. We appreciate all the donations, and make sure that you're going to give them to the right organizations.
Yeah.
But be able to make a change or a dent in whatever way possible.
Finally, the clothes we got from the drive would be delivered by us to the same shelters we had referenced on the back of our brochures. Thank you for listening. I hope you found what we had to say interesting and informative. Have a good day.